She was beaten for 7 hours. No one called for help. By the time they checked if she was breathing, her body was already cold. But here's what they don't want you to know. This wasn't just murder. It was a message. 7 hours of pure terror. A locked door. A VIP booth turned into a crime scene. And a killer who thought he was untouchable. But what makes this case even more disturbing? He almost got away with it. Because this wasn't just a crime, it was a test. A test of how far power and corruption could bend the system in his favor. So who was he? And how did he go from government official to murderer? Khwandike Bishimbayev wasn't just another businessman. He was born into power, raised in privilege, and taught from an early age that the rules of the world didn't apply to him. He wasn't self-made, he was positioned. Born on April 11, 1980, in Kizilorda, Kazakhstan, he was the eldest son of Vakhan Bishimbayev, a former parliament deputy, and Almira Bishimbayeva, a powerful entrepreneur who owned large companies. In a country where connections meant everything, Khwandike had all the right ones. His childhood was paved with elite schools, wealth, and access to Kazakhstan's most powerful figures. His education was just as prestigious. He attended the Kazakh Academy of Management, then Taraz University, before securing a presidential scholarship to study at George Washington University in the United States. He was intelligent, there was no denying that. By 26, he had already earned a PhD in economic sciences, a rare achievement that positioned him as a rising star in Kazakhstan's financial and political sectors. But intelligence alone wasn't what made Khwandike dangerous. It was his ability to manipulate systems, to navigate power like a seasoned politician before he even held office. He understood money, control, and, most importantly, people. His career started in banking, where he quickly moved up the ranks. A brief stint at the Ministry of Economy gave him a taste of government power, but it wasn't enough. He wanted more. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he had secured senior roles in some of Kazakhstan's largest companies, dealing in multi-million-dollar investments, high-level financial strategies, and, as later investigations would reveal, backroom deals. Then, in 2016, he got what he had been waiting for, an official position at the top. He was appointed Kazakhstan's Minister of National Economy, one of the most influential roles in the government. At just 36 years old, he was in charge of billions of dollars in projects, international investments, and national financial policies. It was a position that made him untouchable. For a while, it seemed like he had one. He had wealth, status, and influence. But what people didn't see was the way he operated behind closed doors. The bribes, the backdoor negotiations, the favors exchanged between those in power. Khwandike had built his empire on corruption, and eventually it all caught up to him. Just 8 months after taking office, he was dismissed in disgrace. A corruption scandal had exposed large-scale bribery, implicating him in millions of dollars worth of illegal deals. The government had no choice but to make an example out of him. In 2018, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But this was Khwandike Bishimbayev, a man who had never faced consequences in his life. He knew exactly how to play the system, and the system played along. He spent just 1 year behind bars before securing a presidential pardon. A phone call, a favor, a deal struck in a place no one could see. By 2019, he was walking free, his record wiped clean, his reputation bruised but not broken. If anything, his time in prison had made him more dangerous. He had tested the limits of the law, and he had won. But power wasn't enough anymore. Money wasn't enough. His years of privilege had conditioned him to believe he could take whatever he wanted, with no consequences. And that mindset didn't just apply to business. It applied to people. Khwandike had been married twice before he met Sultanat Nunova. His first wife, Agaram Rova, had married him in 1999 when he was just 19 years old. The marriage lasted 5 years and ended quietly in 2004. They had one son together, Ali Sander, but Khwandike never spoke publicly about his first family. His second wife, Nazim Karman Baba Galova, was with him much longer, from 2006 to 2020. They had 3 children together. To the public, he seemed like a respectable family man, someone who had reformed after his prison sentence. But those who knew him behind closed doors told a different story. He wasn't just controlling, he was possessive. His temper was unpredictable, his need for dominance overwhelming. And when his second marriage ended in 2020, it wasn't long before he set his sights on someone new. Her name was Sultanat. And from the moment they met, she never really had a choice. Sultanat Nunova wasn't the type of woman people expected Khwandike Bishimbayev to be with. She was independent, financially successful, and had built her own influence, without the shadow of corruption behind her. She was the kind of woman who didn't need a powerful man. But that didn't stop Kwon-ik from making sure she needed him. Born on May 15, 1992, in Pavlodar, Kazakhstan, Sultanat grew up in a family of privilege, but unlike Kwon-ik, she wasn't defined by it. Her father, Amanjuldi Nukhanov, was a businessman. Her mother, Jumagal, was an economist. Her uncle, Karat Nukhanov, was a well-known political figure. Connections were there if she wanted them, but she wasn't interested in politics or business. Her passion was in something entirely different, the stars. From a young age, she had been drawn to astrology. What started as a fascination turned into a career. She didn't just read horoscopes. She built an empire around them. By her late 20s, she was one of Kazakhstan's most sought-after astrologers, with consultations booked months in advance. Her following on social media was massive, made up almost entirely of women. That was important to her. She only offered readings to women, never men. That should have been the end of it. That should have been the reason why Kwon-ik Bishimbayev never entered her world. But when a man like him wants something, he doesn't accept no. It started in the spring of 2022. Kwon-ik had come across Sultanat's social media profile. Maybe it was her confidence. Maybe it was her success. Maybe it was the fact that she was off-limits to him. Whatever the reason, he became fixated. He reached out, requesting an astrological consultation. She refused. Firmly. She didn't work with men. It was a boundary she had always kept. But Kwon-ik wasn't used to hearing no, and he didn't intend to start now. At first, he was persistent in a way that seemed harmless. Compliments, admiration, a flood of messages. He praised her intelligence, her insight, her business success. But behind the charm, he was gathering information. He studied her habits, her interests, her weaknesses. Over the months, his persistence escalated. Eventually, after enough pressure, Sultanat agreed to meet with him. Not for a personal reading, but for a business discussion. A simple conversation. She had no intention of becoming involved with him. When she met him in person, she felt nothing. No attraction. No spark. She even told her brother, Ibek, that astrologically and personally, they were completely incompatible. There was a 12-year age gap between them. She wasn't interested. She wasn't impressed. But what she didn't realize was that Kwon-ik never relied on first impressions. He didn't need to be her type. He didn't need her to be interested. He just needed to get inside her world. By the fall of 2022, something had shifted. Kwon-ik had broken down every barrier between them. The man she once found unappealing had become a presence in her life she couldn't ignore. And then, out of nowhere, he proposed. It was unexpected. A shock to her family. A shock to her friends. And maybe even a shock to Sultanat herself. Because despite all her reservations, she said yes. They were married in December 2022. It was extravagant, luxurious, everything about it screamed power and wealth. But legally, it meant nothing. The ceremony was an unregistered Muslim wedding, not recognized by the state. A tradition, but not a contract. For someone like Kwon-ik, a man who thrived on control, that detail mattered. Because it meant that even in marriage, she had no legal protections. Sultanat changed after the wedding. The woman who once dismissed Kwon-ik as corrupt now defended him. She insisted he had been framed, that he was misunderstood, that he was a good man who had been given a second chance. But the truth had a way of breaking through. At first, the problems were small. Tensions with his family. They lived in the Bishimbayev family home, and his mother, Almira, was welcoming to Sultanat, but that didn't make life easier. The expectations were different. The world Sultanat had entered wasn't one she controlled. And then came the first real warning sign. New Year's Eve, 2022. A simple misunderstanding. A gift. Sultanat had received a bottle of expensive perfume from Kwon-ik. She hadn't thought much of it and later re-gifted it to her cousin's wife. A harmless gesture. But when Kwon-ik found out, something snapped. It wasn't just anger, it was rage. He overturned the entire dinner table in front of everyone. Screamed at her. Humiliated her. In an instant, the image of the charming, sophisticated businessman shattered. Sultanat confided in her brother, Ibek. She told him that since the wedding, Kwon-ik had changed. But she believed it would get better. She thought it was just a moment of temper. Just one bad night. She didn't realize it was only the beginning. Sultanat believed marriage would change Kwon-ik. And she was right. But not in the way she expected. At first, it was small things, possessiveness disguised as affection, a sharp tone hidden behind a smile. Little rules that didn't seem like rules until she realized she was the only one following them. Then, the isolation started. At first, she was busy. Too busy to see her friends. Too busy to take her usual client calls. Too busy to reply to certain messages. But somehow, she was never too busy for him. It was slow, subtle, and by the time she noticed, it was already too late. Because once Klondike had her exactly where he wanted her, he stopped pretending. Sultanat had always believed in signs. The universe, the stars, they guided her. But in the weeks after the wedding, she felt something she had never felt before. Something she couldn't name. Something she couldn't explain. It started with whispers. Not the kind you hear, but the kind you feel. A shift in the air. The unshakable sense that she was being watched, even when she was alone. And then, there was the door. Klondike had always been controlling, but one night, Sultanat noticed something strange. A habit. Every night before bed, he would double-check the locks. Not just the front door, all of them. Bedroom, bathroom, even the windows. At first, she thought it was paranoia. Until one night, she woke up and realized he wasn't locking her out. He was locking her in. Sultanat told herself it was nothing. A misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew this was different. Because now, every time he looked at her, something in his eyes had changed. Something darker. And when she finally tried to leave, she found out just how far he was willing to go to keep her. February 2023. By now, Sultanat had stopped making excuses. The man she married wasn't the man she thought he was. And the worst part? He never had been. She decided to leave. Not forever, just for a few days. A visit to her family. Some space. Some clarity. But Klondike had other plans. That night, Sultanat packed a small bag. She didn't tell him. She didn't need to. Because the moment she reached for her phone, he was already there. Watching. Waiting. She didn't even hear him enter the room. Going somewhere. Her stomach dropped. She had never been scared of him before. Not really. But something in the way he said it, calm, almost amused, made her skin crawl. I was just going to see my family for a bit, she said. Casual. Light. Like nothing was wrong. Like he wasn't already blocking the door. And then he laughed. Not loud. Not forced. Just a quiet chuckle, like she had said something funny. Then he leaned in. Close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. You're not leaving. And in that moment, Sultanat knew. This wasn't a marriage. It was a prison. And Klondike? He was the warden. And he was never letting her go. Sultanat had always been known for her beauty. Her flawless skin, her radiant smile. But when she sent her brother, Ibek, those selfies, her face swollen, her eye darkened, none of that was there anymore. No caption. No explanation. Just a picture of her looking straight into the camera. Like she was trying to say something. And then, she disappeared. Ibek demanded answers. He went straight to Klondike, but instead of denial or even an excuse, he got something much worse. A smirk. Mind your own business. No mention of where she was. No concern. Just those 4 words. Dismissive. Cold. Like Sultanat wasn't a person, just his possession. And then, 2 weeks later, she was back. Not hiding. Not running. But standing right beside Klondike, hand in hand, telling everyone that nothing was wrong. That she loved him. That she chose to stay. And for a moment, it seemed like the story was over. A troubled marriage, a misunderstanding, a private matter. But then, something even stranger happened. A vacation. The Maldives. White sand, turquoise water. A place for lovers, not prisoners. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. Klondike and Sultanat posted pictures, sunsets, candlelit dinners, the perfect couple in the perfect paradise. But behind the curated smiles, something else was happening. Because when the court reviewed the evidence later, they found something chilling. Sultanat had bruises. Deep ones. Fresh ones. And not from an accident. They weren't visible in the photos, of course. But in private, away from the filters and carefully posed angles, the truth was impossible to hide. Someone had hurt her. And there was only one person who could have done it. But the real horror? She still wasn't leaving. Because by now, Sultanat wasn't just in love. She was trapped. After the Maldives, everything changed. Sultanat stopped working. Not by choice, by force. Klondike forbade it. No more astrology readings. No more independence. No more income. He controlled what she did. Who she spoke to. Where she went. Her phone? monitored. Her friends? Cut off. Her life? No longer hers. And yet, to the outside world, everything looked fine. Because Sultanat still smiled in pictures. She still posted. But only with him. Only what he approved. Behind closed doors, she confided in a friend. She admitted the truth: he was controlling, jealous, violent. But when asked why she didn't leave, her answer was always the same. She couldn't. But what she didn't know, the worst was yet to come. By the summer of 2023, Sultanat knew she had to leave. The bruises on her body were one thing, but the real damage was harder to see. It was in her voice when she spoke about him, in the way she hesitated when her brother asked if she was okay, and how she pulled away from the people who cared about her most. She finally packed her things and moved back in with her parents, thinking she was done with Kwon Ike for good. But it wasn't that simple. He refused to let her go. He begged her to come back, swearing that things would be different. He told her he had changed, that he couldn't live without her. He promised her a fresh start, a new life together. And she believed him. Or maybe she just needed to believe him. Somewhere deep down, she still had hope. Hope that if she gave him one last chance, things would finally be different. She even started to believe that having a child together might fix things. But when she struggled to conceive, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. By October, she couldn't take it anymore. She rented an apartment and, with Ibek's help, tried to start over. Her family thought this was it. She was finally free. But then, just 10 days later, she was back at Kwon Ike's side. Not only did she return to him, but she went even further, renewing their Muslim marriage vows. It was a moment that left her family stunned. She wasn't just forgiving him. She was committing to him all over again. 3 days later, on November 5th, Kwon Ike and Sultanat hosted a family dinner at a restaurant owned by his cousin. To everyone else, they looked happy, even affectionate. There was no sign that anything was wrong. If someone had seen them that night, they never would have guessed that in less than 72 hours, one of them would be dead. On November 8th, Sultanat and Kwon Ike went to a Dimash Kudaibergen concert with friends. The music was loud, the crowd was electric, but beneath it all, something else was happening, something no one noticed at the time. They were fighting. Not a small argument. Not a disagreement. This was something bigger. Sultanat had finally made up her mind. She was leaving, and this time, it was for good. At some point during the concert, they abruptly got up and left. Instead of going home, they went straight to Bao, the restaurant owned by Kwon Ike's cousin. It was late, and they were seated in a private VIP booth. The door closed behind them. No one else was allowed inside. That night, Sultanat made one final phone call to Ibek. She told him it was over. She was leaving Kwon Ike and staying with him. She sounded certain. She wasn't asking for permission or looking for reassurance. She had made her decision. But Kwon Ike had overheard the call. And that was all it took. At some point, Sultanat tried to leave. She got up, walked out of the restaurant, and headed for the exit. But Kwon Ike followed her. Surveillance footage captured what happened next. It showed them outside, standing just past the entrance, locked in a heated argument. He was grabbing her arm, pulling her back, shaking her as she tried to walk away. The footage was clear, but his lawyer would later describe it differently. He would call it stroking. But there was nothing gentle about what happened next. Whatever he said to her in those 15 minutes outside was enough to make her turn around and follow him back inside. It was a decision that sealed her fate. Once inside, Sultanat locked herself in the bathroom. It was the only place she could escape from him. But Kwon Ike wasn't going to let her shut him out. He kicked the door open. And that's when the real violence began. The beating was brutal. He screamed at her, accusing her of being ungrateful, of using him for his money. He humiliated her, forcing her to strip naked and flush her jewelry down the toilet, as if trying to erase any trace of the life she had before him. When she fought back, he shoved her so hard that she hit the toilet. She collapsed, but the attack didn't stop. He kept going. More blows. More injuries. By 7 a.m., Sultanat was barely conscious. But instead of stopping, Kwon Ike grabbed her by the hair and dragged her back to the VIP booth. That was where she spent her final hours, alone with him, beaten and broken, struggling to breathe. Later, he would claim that she had simply fallen asleep. But what he was actually hearing was something else. The sound of her death rattle. The last noise she would ever make. By noon, Kwon Ike realized she was dead. There were only two things he could do: call for help or cover his tracks. He chose to cover his tracks. His first instinct wasn't to call an ambulance or get medical attention. Instead, he picked up his phone and dialed a fortune teller. She told him not to worry, Sultanat was just drunk. She would wake up soon. But she didn't. So he made a second call, this time to his cousin. What happened next was methodical. The restaurant was shut down. The staff was sent home. The CCTV footage was deleted. They thought they had erased everything. But what they didn't realize was that forensic experts would later recover the footage. And when they did, the truth was laid bare. And it was far worse than anyone had imagined. By the time medics finally arrived, Sultanat's body was already cold. Bajanov had waited. Hours passed where she might have still been alive, where someone could have saved her. But when help finally came, it was too late. She was gone. The police didn't hesitate. Klondike and Bajanov were both taken into custody, but this was far from a simple case. Klondike had spent years bending the system to his will, and this time, he was going to try again. Klondike had a story ready. He told investigators Sultanat had been drunk, that she was stumbling around the restaurant, falling over, hurting herself. Bajanov backed him up, saying they deleted the CCTV footage to protect her honor. But there was just one problem. The footage wasn't completely gone. Forensic experts managed to recover it. And what it showed made one thing clear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drunken fall. This was a brutal, calculated attack. Sultanat's family didn't trust the justice system, not when it came to a man like Klondike. They demanded the trial be open to the public, fearing his wealth and influence would buy him a way out. And they weren't alone. The case exploded across Kazakhstan and beyond. People were horrified, not just by what had happened to Sultanat, but by the terrifying possibility that Klondike might actually walk free. Desperate to avoid a life sentence, Klondike made a calculated move. He requested a jury trial, knowing that under Kazakh law, a life sentence could only be given if every juror and the judge agreed. If even one person hesitated, he had a chance. In court, Klondike tried to shift the blame. He painted Sultanat as unstable, an alcoholic who provoked him, someone who made him lose control. But then, his ex-wife, Nazim, stepped forward. She told the court exactly who Klondike Bishimbayev was, a man who had been violent for years. A man who had only gotten worse after his 2017 release from prison. A man who didn't just lose control one night, but had always been this way. And then, Bajanov flipped. Hoping for a lighter sentence, he turned on Klondike, detailing everything that happened that night. But even as he testified, he made one chilling request: protection. Because even behind bars, Klondike was dangerous. At first, Klondike was only charged with domestic violence, a charge that, in Kazakhstan, carried a shockingly lenient sentence. The public erupted. A woman had been tortured, humiliated, and murdered, and the system was treating it as a domestic dispute. The backlash was so intense, it forced the government's hand. In April 2024, Kazakhstan introduced new, harsher domestic violence laws. And suddenly, Klondike wasn't just facing minor charges anymore. Now, he was charged with murder with particular cruelty, torture, and grievous bodily harm. Charges that could put him away for decades. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about changing the system itself. The courtroom was silent. Every seat was filled. The world was watching. And then, guilty. Klondike Bishimbayev, convicted of murder. The judge didn't stop there. He listed out every crime Klondike had been found guilty of. For taking Sultanat's life with calculated, drawn-out cruelty, 20 years for murder. For the relentless beatings, the torment, the suffering he put her through before that final night. 7 more years for battery and torture. And in the end, with partial term additions, Klondike was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Bajanov, for his role in covering up the crime, was sentenced to 4 years, a reduced sentence, thanks to his cooperation. Sultanat's father sat quietly as the verdict was read. He had fought for life in prison, and to him, 24 years wasn't enough. Her brother, Aybek, put it another way. For a man like him, 24 years might as well be a life sentence. Because by the time Klondike is released, if he ever is, he won't be the powerful, feared man he once was. He'll be forgotten. A relic of a system that let him get away with everything, until the day it didn't. And for someone like him, that might be worse than death. Klondike Bishimbayev spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. That no matter what he did, corruption, abuse, even murder, he would always walk away. But this time, he was wrong. Sultanat's murder didn't just expose him. It exposed everything: the failures of the justice system, the way power shielded the guilty, the way women suffered in silence because they knew no one would help them. Her death forced change. It forced reform. It forced Kazakhstan to look at itself and say enough. And now, for the first time in his life, Quandaych Bishimbayev had no power left at all. The courtroom doors closed. The cameras shut off. The headlines moved on. But here's the question that lingers: was justice really served? Quandaych Bishimbayev got 24 years. But Sultanat got a death sentence. And the truth is, Sultanat isn't the only one. She wasn't the first. And unless something changes, she won't be the last. Because the real monster? It wasn't just him. It was the system that let him get away with it for years. The people who turned a blind eye. The silence that made sure no one stepped in before it was too late. And now, you have to ask yourself, would you have seen the warning signs? This isn't just a crime story. It's a reality. So now, you have a choice. Do you scroll past, forget her name, move on to the next story? Or do you say her name? Do you remember what happened? Do you refuse to let silence win? Because silence is what let Quandaych Bishimbayev become who he was. And the only way to stop the next one is to break it. Share this story. Make sure Sultanat isn't forgotten. And if you want more true crime stories that expose the truth and demand justice, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story? It might be one the world tried to erase.